Okay, so we are at 29 now, and so plus two rooms I have on-site viewing. So, what do you think? How should we start or wait for a little bit more? I think people just will continue dripping in all during the session.
Oh yeah, I would start, because we don't want to cut her short at the end. And of course,
Okay.
we record all this. And Tessa, I'd like to share your slides with the thousands of other people that can't be here right now. So I think, don't worry, they'll get the information one way or another.
Okay. Thank you then. Then I would like to welcome you all to the second day of BTR in the Eastern Track. And today's amazing headliner is Tessa Sanchez from Uber. She's the head of sustainability policy at Uber, and she's leading global policy initiatives to expand access to electric transportation and advance the company's commitment to an electric future. So her work basically focuses on building partnerships with governments, NGOs, and the industry to make EV adoption and discharging infrastructure more accessible worldwide. So before joining Uber, Tessa spent almost 5 years at Tesla, developing EV charging and clean energy policy across the US and Canada. Before that, she worked for the Department of Environment in San Francisco on the city's EV roadmap and charging infrastructure, and she holds a BA in environmental analysis and policy from Boston University. Tessa, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks and kind of good evening or good morning or afternoon, wherever you're calling in from. Such an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me, and especially thanks to Kara for pulling me in. As mentioned, my name is Tessa Sanchez. I lead sustainability policy here at Uber. Um, and this conference is new to me, sounds super interesting. I'm myself am eager to kind of like dig into some of the slides afterward. But kind of like as noted, I am not a researcher or an academic. I do policy grunt work. So when Kara asked whether or not I'd want to give a keynote, I'll admit it was a little bit intimidating. There's so much kind of expertise in this room. But so I've kind of like been thinking a little bit about, what can I say and kind of like what perspective can I bring to kind of add to this conversation. So kind of like came to rather than kind of like telling you everything Uber knows about transportation, I thought that I'd focus on what we know best is it's what we're seeing on our platform and what we're hearing directly from drivers, and then what that can tell us about the transition that's happening in transportation more broadly. So next slide. So best place to start with that is probably with the story of Uber and a little background on that. So next slide. I imagine that many of you have maybe used Uber, maybe have used a kind of like ride share or ride hail mobility app. But when Uber started, the idea was pretty simple. It was, press a button and you get a ride. And I think that the basic idea, that basic concept behind the company really hasn't changed all that much. You still press a button. But today, what can show up on the other side of that button looks very different than it did more than a decade ago. So it could be a ride, it could be food or groceries. And then increasingly, it's kind of different forms of mobility altogether. What has changed a lot since our early days is the scale. So today, Uber operates in 15,000 cities across 70 countries and 6 continents, and we facilitate about 40 million trips a day. So to put that in perspective, kind of by the time I'm finished speaking to you all today, I think there will roughly be about like a million trips that have happened on the platform, which is kind of staggering. So I think that scale gives us a pretty unique window into kind of how people move and kind of how the transportation system is changing. Next slide. So when we think about the future of mobility, we tend to kind of like think about it through three lenses: electric, shared, and autonomous. Today, I'm going to spend my time on electric because we have learned a lot through that transition. We could do entirely separate keynotes on shared and autonomous, but we'll save that for another time. So we will start with our electric journey. Next slide. Okay, so how is our transition going? So at a high level, like the numbers are very encouraging. Um, as of the first quarter of this year, there were 339,000 EVs on the Uber platform. We have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in electrification programs and incentives and partnerships and product improvements, and we're seeing that investment translate into adoption. Uber's already the most widely available platform for zero emission rides, and drivers are electrifying up to 5 times faster than the average motorist in Canada, Europe, and the US. So there is a lot of real momentum happening. But when you kind of look at this growth curve on the screen, um, the it looks remarkably smooth. But kind of getting to this point has been kind of like anything but smooth. There's kind of been a lot of tremendous amount of work kind of growing that curve. Next slide. This is another stat we're pretty particularly proud of. 1 in 4 riders globally tell us that their first ever ride in an electric vehicle was through Uber. So I like the stat. We like to talk the stat because it shows that Uber's role isn't just limited to helping drivers themselves make the transition. We're kind of giving millions of riders and a chance to experience a EV, and oftentimes for the first time. So it's kind of like millions of these, like almost like test drives are happening every day and kind of exposing the general population to electric vehicles. Next slide. Um, but if we rewind the clock a little bit to back to kind of like 2021, EVs were still an outlier on the platform. So like only like 0.3% of miles were in the US and Canada were being completed in an EV. So we started asking drivers kind of like a pretty straightforward question, like why are you not considering an EV? And they told us a couple different themes, and kind of like a couple themes kind of like popped out. One, they told us EVs are too expensive. The second, that there's a lot of confusing information and kind of uncertainty that can lead to drivers to kind of do nothing. And then third, something I think we've heard a lot about is charging anxiety. So those kind of three concerns kind of have become like really important in shaping how we as a company have approached electrification. Next slide. So I've kind of taken that feedback and thought about a bigger question of like, how can Uber actually make a difference and kind of move some of these drivers into EVs? We and kind of like how can we use our scale to solve some of these practical challenges that drivers had? So this leads to what we call our electrification flywheel. There are 3 pieces to it. We need to build the customer demand so drivers know there are riders actively choosing electric options. We need to remove barriers for drivers, particularly around cost and charging and access to vehicles. And then thirdly, we need to build awareness. So kind of make sure both riders and drivers understand what's available and kind of like how to take advantage of it. And the idea is that, all these 3 things kind of reinforce each other. Kind of more rider demand creates more opportunity for drivers, and more EV drivers create greater availability and reliability for riders. And then kind of like better awareness kind of helps the whole system kind of move faster. Next slide. And so that kind of that flywheel kind of informs our focus areas and kind of like how we as a company put this into practice. So um, so on the rider side, what we do is we build demand through products like Uber Electric and Comfort Electric. These give riders kind of a really easy way to choose an EV, while giving drivers access to additional ride types and opportunities. And importantly, we work to kind of keep these options price comparable with UberX. And on the driver side, we've been really focused on bringing down the total cost of ownership of the vehicles, and we do that in a couple ways. One is through direct incentives to drivers. Had many different iterations of incentives to drivers over the years. In the last year in the US, we launched what's known as our Go Electric grant, in which eligible drivers get $4,000 when they switch to an EV. We also do work with automakers and rental companies to negotiate discounts and kind of make EV access more affordable for drivers, again, kind of like using our scale. And then there's charging, which is something that we are starting to pay a lot more attention to and invest more in. And it's a kind of increasingly a bigger part of our story. So to date, we've partnered with charging providers like EVgo and Revel to offer discounts on charging. We've also invested in companies like It's Electric, and we're kind of exploring more ways to make home charging more accessible. Last thing, I guess like last two things maybe, is kind of on the education front. We think a lot about like how can we help educate drivers and kind of like help them make this choice. So we have an EV hub where drivers can learn about EVs. We do like a mentorship program, and there's like a chat bot. We invest a lot in the like software and like the app itself. So for drivers who already have an EV, we are improving our tools. So like our charge map, we do something called battery or matching, and then charger recommendations that use real-time info to help drivers think about when and where to charge. We also work with cities, and we have a partnership with C40 to expand charging access for ride-hail drivers. So those are some of the kind of levers we've been pulling. But I kind of like as EV adoption grows, the drivers that we're trying to reach are changing too. So we're kind of moving beyond the early adopter phase. So drivers who were already excited about EVs and willing to figure some of this out, they pulled the trigger already. The next group of drivers may need some more convincing. So they're looking at this decision like pretty practically. So does this car make sense financially? Can I charge it easily? Is it going to work for the way I drive? And so that's one of the reasons why we have been doing global survey research year after year. We really want to understand how the driver and the decision that they're making are changing over time. Next slide. So before I get into the research itself, we just want to give credit where credit is due. This body of work is done by our really fantastic policy research and insights team at Uber. They've been running this research for 5 years now, and they're really experts on this survey. And I wish that they could have been here to present themselves, but the timing didn't work out. So you have me instead. So I'm not a researcher, as I mentioned, who designed the survey or the analysis. So if you have questions as we go, I'll kind of do my best to answer them. But if we get into something like particularly technical about the methodology, I may have to get back to the team. So with that caveat, we can dive into some of the findings from our EV 5.0 global report. Next slide. Okay, so just some quick notes on the methodology. So we work with an external research agency, but we survey drivers directly from Uber's own driver base. As I mentioned, we've been doing this for 5 years now, and we've been kind of adding markets along the way. The latest wave had 20,000 responses across 13 markets. So the US, Canada, Australia, India, Taiwan, UK, France, Portugal, Netherlands, Germany, Brazil, Mexico, and Chile. And we talked to both EV drivers and non-EV drivers. I think for this survey, and this may not be exactly right, but I think we try to get a pretty good split. So about 10,000 EV drivers, 10,000 non-EV drivers. We asked them about what they drive, how they got their vehicle, where they park, what they spend, and then also a lot of questions on charging. And then for drivers who haven't switched, we spend a lot of time, ask a lot of questions about what is holding them back. Okay, next slide. Okay, so one of the first things that we looked at is why drivers got the car they're driving and how they park. So go into that. Okay, so since this is the first cut of the survey data, I'm just gonna spend a minute kind of like orienting you all. So to the extent that you can see the screen, so at the bottom left, you'll be able to see very tiny print the actual question that we asked drivers. So for this slide in particular, what we asked was we asked drivers what best describes them. Did they already have the vehicle before they started driving with Uber, or did they get the vehicle specifically to drive with Uber? Across the bottom of the slide, you'll see the different markets. So, and you can see we split the results between EV drivers and non-EV drivers. So you can compare the two. So EV drivers in green, non-EV drivers in gray. And you'll also see a number in parentheses above some of the results. So that shows the change from last year's survey. So if you see like a +5, for example, the result is up 5 percentage points from last year. And if there's no change, you'll see kind of NC. So starting with this one, the pattern is pretty consistent. So with the exception of India, EV drivers are more likely to say they got their vehicle specifically to drive with Uber. And non-EV drivers are more likely to say, I already had this car and then I started to drive with Uber. You can see this pretty clearly in the US and Canada. Same general pattern shows up across most of the other markets. And for a lot of these EV drivers, getting the car was a deliberate investment connected with driving with Uber. Next slide. Okay, and here you can see that EV drivers are also much more likely to have bought that vehicle new. So for non-EV drivers, pre-owned or used vehicles are more common, particularly in the US, Europe, and Brazil. And the survey doesn't tell us why exactly it is. But one thing that kind of may be until like pretty recently, there hasn't been much of a mature secondhand market for EVs. So if you want an EV, your options were much more likely to be new. So I think it's something will be interesting to watch as EVs start making their way more into the used car market. Next slide. Then we look at vehicle ownership status. So most drivers own their vehicle and are making loan payments, but non-EV drivers are more likely to own their car outright. So kind of like if you have a car that works perfectly well, and especially if you've paid it off, you may not be in any hurry to replace it. Next slide. And the other thing we looked at is where drivers park at night. So about half have private off-street parking. So that could be anything from like a driveway to a garage or something like that. Maybe it's a dedicated parking space, a multifamily or condo building. So half have private off-street parking. That means that half don't. And it varies quite a bit by market, unsurprisingly. So in places like Portugal and Netherlands, we see a lot more street parking. And then in India, shared or common off-street parking is more common. That obviously has implications for charging. So if you have a driveway or garage, putting in a home charger may be an option, but if you're parking on the street every night, that's a very different situation. So we'll keep this one in mind. This is going to be a kind of a theme that we come back to as I go on in the presentation. Next slide. Okay, so now let's look at drivers who haven't switched to an EV. Next one. Okay, so first, what are they driving today? So in the US and Canada, gas is still dominant. Same across much of Latin America. Europe looks pretty different. Places like Portugal and Netherlands, there's more diesel. Taiwan has much larger hybrid shares. So even the vehicle that people are switching from looks pretty different, kind of market to market. Next slide. Only around only around 3 in 10 drivers say that they're planning to change their vehicle within the next year in most markets. That's higher in Latin America, although we've seen that come down a little bit there. For most drivers, a new vehicle just isn't an immediate decision. That puts kind of like the EV consideration numbers into a little bit more context. You could be completely open to an EV, but still not have a reason to buy another car anytime soon. Next slide. And when we ask why they're not planning to change their vehicle, the answer across markets is that they generally just like the car that they have. So in the US, for example, about half say they're satisfied with their current vehicle. Affordability for sure comes up. So places like the UK. And some drivers still have kind of loans or kind of contracts that they're locked into with the vehicle that they already have. So again, being interested in the EV doesn't necessarily mean that you're ready to go out and buy one for these reasons. Next slide. Okay. So now we'll look at kind of like how open non-EV drivers actually are to making the switch. So a couple things I want to point out. First is that there's still like a pretty meaningful level of interest. So in every market we surveyed, at least about a third of drivers say they're open to an EV as their next vehicle. But there's quite a bit of variation by country. Portugal is the highest at 57%. France is high at 50%. In Taiwan, which we just added to the survey this year, comes in at 51%. Netherlands is pretty interesting, up 4 points from last year's survey to 49%. We also see something similar in Brazil, kind of up 5 points from last year to 47%. On the other side, Mexico and Chile came down this year. Mexico dropped 7 points and to 44%, and Chile dropped pretty sharply 13 points to 36%. Canada's held pretty steady. UK is also pretty steady, pretty flat. The US came down a little bit, 3 points this year to 34%. So I think a couple things are going on. One is that it's a very different story depending on the market. We have places where interest is really holding up or even growing, and others where it's just plateauing a bit. And the other is kind of what we talked to earlier. We're kind of past the early adopter phase. Some of these drivers who were interested a few years ago may have already bought their EV. Some have gone to hybrid. Some are kind of sticking with their petrol or gas vehicle. So I wouldn't look at this and say that interest in EVs has gone away. It certainly has not. But that the next group of drivers may just be a little bit harder to move. Next slide. When we ask drivers who are interested in EVs what they'll look for, we hear some pretty practical answers. So they're interested in comfort and quality and purchase price and range, and then ongoing costs and of driving and charging are also things that they're looking for, which makes sense. These are people who use their vehicles to earn money, so they're kind of evaluating an EV as a business decision as much as a personal purchase. Next slide. And when we ask why they would make the switch, economics kind of come through pretty strongly. So drivers are attracted to the idea of paying less for electricity than fuel. They're attracted to lower maintenance costs. Things like incentives and discounts and Uber specific benefits also help too. The environmental benefits also show up. That's what drivers tell us. Drivers talk about cleaner air and the impact they're having on cities, especially in countries like India. So that's also good to see. I think, but the core value proposition is still kind of very practical. Can they want to know, can this vehicle work for me, and can it save me money over time? Next slide. We also have asked drivers whether or not they would consider a used or pre-owned EV. There's quite a bit of openness to it. Around half would consider a pre-owned or a used EV in most markets. So in the US, it's 61%. In the UK, it's 73%. So as the used EV market grows, it could potentially open up another path for drivers who may not be able to or may not want to buy a new EV. Okay. So now we'll talk about switching barriers, more switching barriers for non-EV drivers. So kind of what is stopping them. Okay, so before we get into the drills, I'm just going to explain a little bit about how we asked this question. So we gave drivers this list of potential barriers and asked them to score each one from 1 to 5. 1 meant this is not really a concern for me. 5 meant this is a very critical barrier. So what you see here is just the percentage who gave each issue a 5. So there's a lot on this slide, but a couple things kind of jump out. So I think first is that the US and the UK, in the US and the UK, charging, and particularly the kind of time associated with charging, stands out. So 41% of US drivers and 50% of UK drivers say that losing earning time while charging is a barrier, a critical barrier. The UK also has some high concern about charging being difficult and about electricity prices. In Latin America, the picture's a little different. Financing and kind of upfront cost of the vehicle comes through a little bit more strongly. Around half of drivers in Brazil and Chile rate the higher cost of an EV as a critical barrier, and financing is also particularly high across Brazil, Mexico, and Chile. In Taiwan, charging access is a concern, but so is vehicle cost. 39% of drivers there say that charging would be too difficult, while 38% rate the higher cost of an EV as a critical barrier. So there isn't one barrier that kind of looks the same everywhere. Next slide. We kind of double down on this question a little bit. And when we ask drivers what's the single most important barrier, the picture becomes a little bit more clear. Charging comes through pretty strongly, particularly the idea of losing time that they could otherwise be spent earning. In the US, that's the number one issue. We also see the same thing in the UK. Vehicle cost is also still very important. So places like Canada and across Latin America, financing, access to financing also stands out in places like Portugal and Brazil and Mexico and Chile. So it's definitely differences by market, but when we step back and kind of look how things have changed over time, we get to the next slide, there's kind of one shift that really stands out. Next slide. So our policy research team recently published a Medium blog post about this, but we have been observing in the last couple surveys, kind of globally, access to charging has overtaken the cost of the vehicle as the primary perceived barrier to adoption. So a few years ago, cost was the bigger issue. Now we're hearing more about charging concerns from drivers. And we see that pretty clearly in the US and the UK over the last 2 years. And once I'm done with my presentation, I'll drop the blog post into the chat. So when we ask drivers who say that they can't find the right EV, what they mean by that, range is kind of a big part of that. That's particularly pronounced in Europe. In Netherlands, for example, 65% say current EVs don't have, or they perceive, they perceive that it doesn't have the driving range that they need. Also pretty high in UK, France, and Portugal. Trust in battery and technology also comes up too. And some drivers simply say they just don't have enough information, don't know enough about EVs. So there's kind of still an education piece here as well. Next slide. When we ask questions about financing, we found that a lot of drivers are still paying off their current vehicle. You can see that pretty clearly in the US and Canada and Taiwan. And in some markets, some Latin American markets, the bigger issue is getting approved for financing in the first place. And some drivers also just aren't sure what the best financing option is. Okay, my last slide on non-EV drivers. When we ask them what they think makes charging difficult, we hear a couple things. They perceive that it takes too long, that it can take away from driving time, as I've said, and they're worried about running out of battery. They're also worried about finding an available charger, and many don't have anywhere to charge at home. So in Taiwan, for example, not having a place to charge at home really stands out. And then in Brazil, Mexico, and Chile, the availability of the chargers is the bigger concern. Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit. Now we're going to talk about drivers who have made the transition to an EV and kind of what their life is like with an EV, what they tell us. So I think the first thing to know is that satisfaction is high. So across most markets, drivers who have switched they're overwhelmingly satisfied with that decision. In the US and Canada, about 80% say that they're satisfied. That's even higher in India, Brazil, Mexico, and Chile. The UK stands out. Only 53% are satisfied, although that satisfaction there did improve quite a bit since the last survey. So I think overall drivers are happy that they made the switch. Next slide. One reason for that is operating costs. So most EV drivers tell us that their operating costs are lower than with other engine types. So in the US, 70% say that they're lower. That's even higher in markets like Taiwan and Brazil. UK, again, is an outlier here. Fewer drivers there are kind of seeing the same savings, although that number has been improving. And, for someone who drives for a living, that obviously matters. Next slide. So when we ask drivers why they chose an EV, we hear many of the same economic arguments. So lower maintenance costs, lower electricity costs compared with gasoline or diesel. And there are also environmental benefits and platform benefits. But again, economics are often a center of their decision making. Next slide. Most drivers found their EV on their own. They may have found it through their own dealer or their own financing solution, and many say that the process was relatively easy. Around 1 in 5 say Uber helped them find the right vehicle. So there's clearly a role for us, but there's also a broader vehicle ecosystem kind of developing and supporting these drivers as well. Okay. Now we're going to get into my favorite part of the research, which is around charging. So what does charging actually look like for drivers who already have an EV? Slide. Okay, so most EV drivers are charging once a day. and a meaningful number are charging twice a day. And that makes sense when you think about how much these vehicles are being driven. They're really not traditional commuter vehicles. Um, the kind of old adage, 80% of charging happens at home, is not necessarily applicable to all Uber drivers. So because of that, even drivers who do have access to home charging, they often need public charging as well. Slide. And because of that, the public fast charging network is really important. Um, so just one quick thing on this slide in particular. So drivers could select all that apply. So these categories aren't mutually exclusive. A driver might charge at home overnight and still use a public fast charger during the day. So in the US, 78% of EV drivers say they use public DC fast charging, but 47% also say that they charge at home. We see high use of public fast charging in a number of other markets as well. So Taiwan and France, Germany, and Chile stand out. So even if a driver starts the day with a full, sorry, I'm in a conference room and my light went off. There we go. Um, so, so even if a driver starts the day with a full battery at home, if that driver is driving a lot of miles, they may need to charge again during the day, and that's why public charging is really so essential for this group. Next slide. When we ask drivers how they found a charger, in the US and Canada, a lot are using navigation built into the cars. In places like India and Portugal, Mexico, and Brazil, EV routing apps are more common. In Taiwan and Chile, drivers are more likely to rely on information directly from charging operators. And relatively few drivers today are using the Uber map to find charging. So it's useful info for us. There's clearly more that we can be doing there within the app itself. Next slide. When drivers have trouble finding public charging, the biggest issue is often that the charger they find is already being used. So that's particularly high in Portugal and the UK. Sometimes the charger is out of order, and sometimes it's too far from where they're driving or where they park. I think the good news is that several of these issues are getting better year over year, and we see that in the data. We see that pretty dramatically, actually, in the UK, US, and the Netherlands. Although availability and reliability still an issue that need to be worked on. Next slide. Okay, and this is so where you can see how charging actually affects the workday. So again, quick note on this, drivers could select all that apply here. So they may have experienced more than one of these issues over the last 3 months. So in the US, 44% of EV drivers say that they've lost more than 10% of their weekly earnings because they spent time charging. In the UK, it's 52%. So waiting for a charger at a busy station is also pretty common. And also you have things like range anxiety, arriving at a broken charger, or not getting the charging speed that you expected. So yeah, so there are some pretty big differences market by market. Next slide. Some good news, I think, on this slide. So in a lot of markets, fewer drivers are having to stop in the middle of their day to charge. So in the US, that came down 9 points from last year. In the UK, it came down 15 points. France and Portugal are also down by 10 points. So we can't exactly say what's driving that from the survey alone. It could be things like better infrastructure, could be better vehicle range, could be different charging habits, but whatever the reason, it's kind of moving in the right direction. Next slide. We're seeing something similar when we ask drivers where they have to decline trips because they're worried they don't have enough battery. It still happens, but in a number of markets, it's happening less often, which is good news. So in the US, it came down 5 points. Canada came down 9 points. India came down 10 points. So again, another sign that the experience is starting to get a little bit easier. Okay, so brings us to the last part of the charging puzzle, which is home charging. Next slide. So across most markets, around half of EV drivers either have their own charger or they have access to a private shared charger. That's good. It also means that a lot of drivers don't. But the UK is pretty interesting here. Access to a private or designated charger increased 17 points from last year. That is encouraging. I'll be interested to see what the next iteration of the survey look like in the UK. There has been a lot of work happening there around residential and on-street charging. So it is possible that that change has to do with that, but we will need to see. This final point on charging for drivers who do have access to home charging, level 2 is generally the dominant option. I think Brazil really stands out here. 91% of drivers with home charging access are using level 2. And we also see very high level 2 usage in France and the UK. Chile is, I think, the exception. Level 1 charging is a little bit more common there. Okay, so next slide. We will quickly recap. Next slide. Okay, so just to kind of summarize, in the US and Canada, most non-EV drivers, they're still driving gas cars, same in Latin America. Europe looks pretty different. There's a lot of diesel and hybrid. In Taiwan, we see more hybrids as well. We saw that EV drivers are more likely to have gotten their car specifically to drive with Uber. They're more likely to have brought it new. For non-EV drivers, it's more common that they already had the car before they started driving with Uber. They are also more likely to have bought it used or to own it outright. The other thing we looked at was parking. So about half of drivers have private off-street parking, but again, it really varies by market. So Portugal and Netherlands, we see a lot more street parking. In India, shared parking is more common. And that obviously matters for charging in general. If you're parking on the street every night, home charging is going to be a lot harder. Next slide. So now for the drivers who have not switched, are non-EV drivers, first thing I'd say that there's still a fair amount of interest in EVs in every market. At least a third of drivers say they're open to one, but that varies. We see a lot of variation there. We see a lot of interest in Portugal, Taiwan, France, but in some of the more mature markets, we see a little bit of cooling over time. For drivers who are interested, the thing that they care about are pretty practical. So like how much does the car cost? Is it comfortable? Does it have enough range? And what's it going to cost me to run it and charge it? We also saw pretty strong interest in used EVs. About half of drivers who are considering an EV would consider buying a used one. There are still barriers, of course. So cost is an issue. Financing is still an issue. Biggest change we've seen over the last few years is around charging. As I've said, drivers are increasingly worried about the time it takes to charge. For an Uber driver, time is money. Time matters because that's time that they may not be spending earning. And we see that kind of most clearly in the US and the UK, where charging is the top barrier. So they're still interested in making the switch, but they have some practical questions that need to be answered before they get there. And then lastly, last slide on our EV drivers. Next slide. There we go. The good news is once drivers make the switch, they're pretty happy with their choice. Satisfaction is high across most of the markets that we looked at. A big part of that comes down to cost and total cost of ownership. Most EV drivers tell us that they think their operating costs are lower than other types of vehicles. They're spending less on maintenance, in many cases, less on electricity than they would on gas or diesel. Um, where drivers are still running into problems is charging. So most of the drivers are charging um, once or twice a day. And because of how many miles they drive, even drivers who can charge on home often need to public fast charge. So when a charger is occupied or broken or too far away, it can really affect their day, can also affect their earnings. But the good news is we're seeing some improvement in a lot of markets. There are fewer drivers having to stop in the middle of their work to charge. And we're also seeing kind of at least the numbers come down on concerns around queuing and reliability and kind of other things. Um, Maybe kind of like one last thing I'll mention. We'll be doing a sixth round of the survey at the end of this year, I believe. So really interested to see what changes. I think kind of anecdotally in a number of markets, we're seeing more EV drivers come onto the platform since the spring. And with fuel prices where they are right now, I'll be interested to see how that shows up in the survey data and whether that changes how drivers are thinking about the economics of an EV and willingness to make the switch. But I think for now, it's a pretty encouraging place to end. And thanks so much for having me. And I'm happy to answer some questions if there are any.
Um, Thank you very much. Yes, there are a ton of questions actually. So you can look at them directly in the chat if you can, but I can also read them. Um, so the first one is
Let's
from,
let me,
I
yeah.
think the first one is Cara at 1118. She asks about how
Uh,
many trips.
yeah. So for the 4K incentive, we have right now it's eligibilities for our diamond and our platinum drivers. Essentially, those are like our highest tenured, kind of like highest mileage drivers. Part of the reason why we made the decision to make it exclusive to those driver types is one, they're like stickiest on the platform. They've been with Uber for a long time. We do have a lot of casual drivers who are kind of on and off the platform. $4,000 is a lot of money, so we want to make sure that it's going to the drivers who have been with us. And then second, because these are drivers who are generally more full-time drivers, they drive the most. We also think that them switching to an EV can have, greatest like GHG reduction benefit as well. I can send the link to the our Go Electric site.
Okay. I think the second
Um,
question you already answered. It was about charging strategy. So
okay.
you can go to the third one from Ellie.
Okay. Um, yes, good question. If we look at academic research on these areas or get benefit from these as well, um, yes, certainly. Although again, I since I don't design the survey, I don't know kind of like exactly like how much extensive research the team does before developing the survey, but they're very good, so I imagine that they do. Um, um, okay, so major economic incentive for the company itself to invest in electric. I think that there are a couple of reasons, and I can just like say this like pretty simply. So I think kind of like one, like if it's better for drivers, it's better for us as a company. And kind of like as you can see for like the drivers who have made the switch, like they're not only satisfied with their vehicle, but they have lower operating costs as well. And so for especially in those markets where the total cost of ownership like really pencils out, happier drivers on the platform is better for us. It's also we think it's better for riders as well. Like, and they tell us that they enjoy the like a more comfortable ride, a more high-tech ride. A lot of times these vehicles, as kind of like seen, like they're newer. And so again, happier riders is good for Uber. And then we also talk about as well, like generally it's like the right thing to do. It's like good for cities, it's good for the places that we operate, cleaner air, et cetera. Um, okay. Um, okay, charging being a concern, elaborating on strategy to provide charging opportunities to drivers. Yeah, so there's I touched on in the beginning a little bit what we're doing with some of the partners that we have relationships with, like EVgo and Revel, where we use our scale to provide discounts to drivers. We're kind of like taking that to the next level, and we'll have some announcements, I'm hoping, in September, where we're kind of building on that concept of what we hope are like pretty steep discounts for drivers off the cost of fast charging. We are seeing, not in every market, but in certain markets where the cost of public fast charging has been going up. Like drivers are telling us that the cost of fast charging is becoming more and more of a concern. So we're hoping to tackle that with what we're rolling out in a couple months, or hopefully next month. We also are we're interested in kind of like tackling the home charging challenge as well. We have we're hoping to build on a pilot that we did in the UK with a company called Pod. Sorry, it's getting dark in here again. Um, in which essentially it's a model where it is zero
Oh, it's
down
really dark.
for, yeah, it's really dark, sorry. It's zero down for the cost of the charger and the installation of the charger, importantly, the home charger. And then there's a monthly subscription fee, and that is like very popular amongst our drivers in the UK. So we'd love to kind of bring that model to other places, especially where there are challenges with access to home charging. Okay. I did not mention how many kilometers a year drivers are driving. I do not have those stats at the top of my head, although I do have, I think, I believe that the stat for, let me see if I can like come back with this really quick. I have some US stats, more so. So again, sorry, this is US specific, and this is just at the top of my fingers right now. But for the US and Canada, the top 20% of drivers on the Uber platform average around 200 miles or more per day, or roughly 40,000 miles a year. And then kind of like comparison, at least like the kind of average like American or Canadian driver drives around 40 miles per day, or 12,000 miles a year. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Take it's driver. The data seems to take the average of drivers responded. You try differentiating the results by age group or gender of the drivers. Good question. I'm not sure. Again, this is one of those questions, those technical questions on methodology. I do not believe that we did those data cuts, but would certainly be interesting to kind of like see some of those breakdowns by demographics. But I do not believe that we have, although I can go back and ask our research team. Do you have any insight on why India is the only country in the survey in which the majority of owners did not buy the vehicle EV to use on Uber? It appears that India has a large percentage of drivers do not own the vehicle. Does that have something to do with it? It's a good question. I am not sure, but that is a really good question, and I can take that one back. Okay, and then I think we're almost at the end.
Yes.
Is there a difference in earnings between EV and non EV drivers? We always are kind of careful when we get this question, not to make kind of like sweeping statements, but we do say that what we do see in our data is since drivers where Uber Electric and Comfort Electric is live, they get access to increased ride types, and so therefore they have increased earning potential. We've also done some studies that show that EV drivers, again, kind of like going back to that more modern, uh, you know, um, newer vehicle, kind of like cleaner ride, that riders really like that, and that kind of does result in some increase tips. But we don't have a kind of like any like again like sweeping generalities that EV drivers are earning a ton more than non-EV drivers, but we do see some of that in the data.
Okay, that was great and perfect timing, actually. I don't know if there is any additional questions. We can probably still 1 or 2 minutes. I have one. I actually used Uber EV driving first time in Portugal recently because it comes as an option, right? It kind of gives you, oh, you have this more eco. So when you look at the choices that customers make, do you think when that option is available, it's tended to be preferred over the conventional vehicles or...
Good question. We've done a lot, not my team in particular, but our global electrification team has done a lot of looking into this. A lot of this also like has to do with like app design and kind of like the
Yeah.
product selector and kind of like where it shows up in the app. So I don't know the answer to your question, but it's something that they do a lot of like A/B testing on. We do see that, especially in certain markets, like there is a very specific rider preference for an EV ride. And then in other markets, less so. But again, we've done like a lot of looking into. It's very important that it's like actually viewable within the product selector. Sometimes you have to scroll down, so depends.
Okay, thank you very much. I think with that, I would like to conclude this excellent presentation. Again, Tessa, thank you very much for joining us. For the rest of the audience, you can stay in this session to continue for it's actually about EVs, right? The next section is going to be about electric vehicles and charging systems in this room. There's also going to be the section E10 shared mobility and micromobility on separate room. I think Anissa is going to share the links there, and also session 11 on freight operations and supply chains on yet another room. So please enjoy the rest of the conference, and let's get